Hello, my name's Denton, and I'd like to say a few words about a subject that I find of great interest. Now, I'm sure you won't even begin to guess what that subject is. It's a hard one, right? I what the, the Vikings? Oh, oh, you guessed. Oh well, there's there's certainly no flies on you. Yes, yes, indeed, the Vikings. They who sailed around in fancy-looking ships with dragon heads on them while committing all sorts of unspeakably nefarious deeds. Or at least, that's the popular image of them. But there's a problem with that. You see, the Vikings got what today we'd call a bad press, which has lingered right down to our own times. Say Vikings to just about anyone, and what instantly springs to mind? Non-stop savage brutality, 24/7, 365 days a year, raiding, looting, killing, raping, burning. See, that's only a part of the picture, and a somewhat exaggerated part as well. There's a lot more to the Vikings than that, though that aspect is how they are chiefly remembered. And without the Vikings, Europe would be a very different place today because their influence was considerable across a wide range of things. In Ireland, where I live, for example, most of the major towns, including the capital Dublin, they weren't founded by the native Irish. They were founded by the Vikings. So let's take a look at some of the real facts of the Viking Age, rather than the usual lurid and often rather distorted images of them. That's why I've called this video The Vikings, the Facts, Not the Fiction. But of course, blood and guts and rampaging bearded men in horned helmets are so much more exciting than everyday domestic matters or cultural or social aspects. Bashing somebody's head in with an axe is more of an audience grabber than, well, combing your hair or changing your clothes. The so-called Viking Age is dated quite precisely, as commencing with the raid on the monastery located on the island of Lindisfarne in Northumbria on the 8th of June 793 AD, and ending with the death of the great Norwegian king Harald Sigurdsson, better known today as Harald Hardrada, which means Harald the Hard Ruler, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September 1066. Curiously enough, both events taking place in England, far from the Scandinavian homeland of the Norse peoples. Of course, the Norse people didn't all magically appear from nowhere in June of 793, dragon-headed ships popping up all over the place, and then suddenly vanish, poof, in a puff of smoke in September 1066. They existed long before and after those very precise dates, but it makes for a convenient category to place the Vikings in for the purpose of historical reference. And it's related to the most well-known aspect of them as far as the general public are concerned: raiding. Now, there's a very good reason for that. You see, Vikings did not exist before 793, nor after 1066. But wait, I hear you say. Didn't I just mention the fact that the Norse people were around both before and after those dates? Well, yes, indeed I did, because they were, but Vikings weren't. Oh no. Confused? Well, the answer is quite simple. All Vikings were Norse, but not all Norse were Vikings. In fact, only a minority of Norsemen, and some women as well, were Vikings. But they didn't call themselves that most of the year. Generally, they were only called Vikings during the summer months. Actually, they never called themselves Vikings as a name, because they weren't, you see. And even when they were, they still weren't actually Vikings as such. Now you're really confused, right? Well, let's just have an overall look at the people of Scandinavia in those times. The Norse people initially inhabited the lands of present-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, though those countries didn't exist in their modern form for much of the Viking Age, being comprised of numerous kingdoms, earldoms, and so on, and would later spread their influence to the British Isles, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Ireland, the Orkneys and Shetland Islands, Greenland, France, the Isle of Man, what is now Russia, and even as far as Constantinople, as well as North America, 500 years before Columbus didn't discover it. Columbus never actually saw the North American mainland. No. He saw islands in the Caribbean. To say Columbus discovered America would be like claiming someone discovered Spain by finding the Canary Islands. He didn't. Anyway, the Vikings were the finest navigators of their time. Their ships are a marvel of technology. They had some of the most advanced social ideas of the early Middle Ages, and they were the finest warriors at that time, even being hired by Byzantine Emperor Basil II to form his own personal bodyguard, becoming the formidable Varangian Guard. And for most of the Viking Age, they were pagans, something that's closely connected with much of their culture and attitudes, until Christianity eventually replaced the gods of Asgard, the old religion having almost completely disappeared by the end of the 11th century. Yes, yes, all right, all right. That's all wonderful. But how, you ask, are the Vikings not Vikings, and even the ones who were Vikings for only part of the year, but they didn't call themselves Vikings even when they were Vikings? Ah, that's because the term Viking, or Vikinger, as it was in Old Norse, was not a term of nationality. A Norseman or woman would have called themselves a Dane, a Norwegian, or a Swede. Those were their nationalities. Viking was a term that referred to those persons who went out in a ship to raid, trade, or later to settle abroad. In other words, to go Viking. So a Scandinavian couldn't be a Viking, but they could go Viking. Rather like a hiker can be someone of any nationality who just goes out for a hike. You wouldn't call, say, a German hiking through the Black Forest a hiker. He or she would still be a German who happened to be engaging in that activity. And if you asked them what they were, they'd say, I'm German. They're not going to say, I'm a hiker. If you could go back to, say, the 9th century, and you asked a man ploughing his field in Norway if he was a Vikinger, he'd probably say, of course not. Do you see a boat? How could I be going Vikinger when I'm here ploughing my field, you idiot? And since they tended to raid during the good weather in summer and return to Scandinavia or to other bases elsewhere during the winter, they were, strictly speaking, only Vikings for a part of the year. So to be a Viking, you had to get into a ship and go somewhere and do something when you got there. If you didn't do any of those things, well, to use that famous Jewish joke, to you, you may be a Viking, but to a Viking, you ain't no Viking. That sums it up perfectly. Oh, what a great line. There are various ideas on where the term Vikinger actually came from and its original true meaning, but it came to mean one who went raiding, a pirate, a seafarer, an explorer, even a settler, all rolled into one. But another interesting thing about it is that nobody at that time used it to describe them, other than the Norse themselves in that very limited raiding-related context. No one else called them Vikings. And had you asked anyone in England or Ireland or anywhere else during the 8th or 9th centuries about Vikings, they wouldn't have known what you were talking about. To the German tribes, they were the Ascomani, the Ashmen, from the ash wood in their ships, while to the Anglo-Saxons they were Dene, Danes, as well as heathens. To the Celtic Irish, they were Dovgal, dark foreigners, Danes, or Fingal, fair foreigners, Norwegians, as well as Gentiles, while to the Franks they were the Northmen, and later became the Normans. The Arabs, Slavs, and Byzantines called them Rus, from a word meaning to row a boat, from which incidentally came the names of Russia and Belarus, where they settled. The term Viking was only introduced into English centuries after Vikings had ceased to exist, and later it came to mean not just seaborne raiders from Scandinavia, but anyone from anywhere the Norse had settled, like Iceland or the Faroe Islands, or anything connected with them. Viking this and Viking that. Things like Viking culture, Viking art, Viking religion, Viking ships, and whatever else you can think of got the Viking prefix added to them, even though none of them actually had anything to do with the word, except for a ship. And even then, only in the terms of those who sailed in it, not the ship itself. There was no Viking music or Viking art, but there was plenty of Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish music and art. So there you have it. The Vikings weren't Vikings, except when they were. Nor, of course, did they go around in horned helmets. No. That would have been rather awkward when going through the low doorways of those days, and a positive health hazard to anyone beside them in the shield wall. You move a bit sideways and you skewer Olaf standing beside you. And big horns sticking out could have been grabbed and used by an adversary as a handle to pull them off balance or pull a helmet off altogether. That myth may have started as a way of demonizing them, the horns to equate them with the devil, though it really only took hold of popular imagination in the 19th century, largely through the operas of Richard Wagner, especially the cycle of music dramas known as Der Ring das Nibelungen. And numerous artists of the time, of course, who liked to draw the Vikings with huge horns or wings that would have done credit to an eagle, sticking out of the helmets. How strange, I think, that they've gained such fame in the popular mind under the wrong name and wearing something they never actually did. Now, as regards helmets, many men wouldn't even have worn a helmet, or they might have had a leather sort of cap-like helmet, or none at all. Farmers or fishermen who went off to join a raid probably wouldn't have been very well equipped, and metal helmets would have been worn by the more seasoned warriors, or the chieftains, the jarls. The only complete Viking helmet ever discovered was what's called the ocular type, similar to this one that I was wearing to begin with. This would have been a very typical helmet from that period. And as I say, the only completely intact Viking helmet ever found was one of that style. The other type of helmet that would have been worn was the so-called nasal type, like this. And this, incidentally, was also the helmet later used by those descendants of the Vikings, the Normans. When Duke William of Normandy landed in England in 1066, his men would have been wearing these. Now, chainmail, as I have on at the moment, was used by the Vikings later on, but it was probably borrowed, shall we say, from dead guys they'd already had dealings with, rather than made by them. And just as the less important or less wealthy men wouldn't have had helmets, so too swords would have been more frequently carried by the experienced or wealthy warriors, or by the nobles. Now this is a typical Viking sword, with the 3 or 5 lobe pommel. This one is a 5. But a weapon like this wouldn't have been cheap, and a farmer, for example, would be more likely to have had a spear or an axe, especially because axes, of course, were plentiful. I mean, just about everyone had an axe of some kind, used as they were for woodworking or getting firewood or so on. There were custom-designed battle axes, of course, some with a long, curving point at the bottom that could have been used to hook an enemy's shield and pull it down. But any large axe, of course, would do it a pinch to bash somebody's head in. And there were smaller throwing axes there, like this one. That would certainly have given you quite a headache. Now, a sword like this one, this would have been far more expensive than the other kind. It has quite elaborate decoration. It's made in several parts. And one like this would perhaps have been carried by a jarl or a very prominent warrior. The Viking equivalent of a grunt wouldn't have had anything like that. Well, unless, of course, he'd taken it from a dead enemy. Now, in that case, a simple farmer or fisherman, the poorest of men, might well have acquired a very expensive sword or a fancy helmet or even some armour, something he couldn't have afforded any other way. But as his spoils, he would have been perfectly entitled to keep it. Now, the Vikings are often seen as scruffy, disheveled, and completely uncivilized, killers and rapists. But that's just as wrong as horned helmets. They weren't unkempt, filthy barbarians, but actually the cleanest people in Europe during the Middle Ages, bathing once a week and washing their hands and faces every day, something that astonished the Anglo-Saxons, who might only bathe once or twice a year, or if at all, for that matter. And what really bothered the Saxons, the Norse changed their underclothing. Now, that was just weird. They changed them. I mean, why would you do that? You'd taken the trouble to put them on. Why bother to keep taking them off? You could do that when you had your annual bath. I mean, all that work. On, off, on, off. It didn't make any sense to the Saxons. Weird. That does say a lot about the Anglo-Saxons. If a deodorant salesperson could go back in a time machine to those days, they'd make a fortune. And both men and women took great trouble with their hair and grooming in general. Beautifully made combs being one of the most common items found in graves or excavations of Norse sites. Nor did they do nothing but raid, pillage, and rape. Admittedly, they did a lot of raging, pillaging, and raping. And they did it very well, if that's the right word. Well, yes, they were bloody good at it, with some emphasis on the bloody part, of course. But while they did do those things, They were also the finest traders, explorers, navigators, and settlers of their day, and they were quite happy to trade rather than raid if the opportunity arose, since that way they got what they wanted without loss to themselves, and often for greater profit. They could pick and choose instead of having to just grab what was there and run. And once they established permanent settlements somewhere, they were not loath to assimilate through marriage with the peoples they found themselves among, as happened very strikingly in Ireland, where eventually there was no difference between Norse and Gael. A good example being King Sidrig Silkbeard, who became ruler of Dublin in the late 10th century, and whose father was a Norse nobleman and his mother an Irish princess. Similar integration occurred in what is now Russia, as well as France, where the land of the Northmen quickly became Normandy and thoroughly French. The Norse didn't seem to have any great problem about integration with other peoples, unlike later Europeans in the colonial era of the 18th and 19th centuries, when integration with the subjugated races of the various empires was more or less unthinkable. Well, damn it, old chap, they're just natives after all. Another point in the Vikings' favour. A great misconception about them is their supposed hatred of Christianity. To put it bluntly, they couldn't have cared less about Christianity as such. Yes, but they raided churches and monasteries. Those are their favourite targets. Irish monks even had to build special tall, inaccessible round towers to hide in when the Vikings came. Well, yes, they did. Religious institutions were their favourite targets. For the same reason, a modern burglar breaks into an obviously wealthy house rather than a run-down, dilapidated one that clearly contains nothing of value. Most of the wealth in those times was held by the church. Churches and monastic institutions were filled with gold and silver objects, precious stones, donations of money, rich fabrics and the like. And priests and monks were about the only people who could read and write, making them very valuable captives who could be sold as slaves. So of course that was where a Viking raider would go. Why would he raid a penniless fishing village if there was a wealthy monastery nearby full of gold and silver? I mean, the Vikings' own religion was non-dogmatic. It didn't have rules and regulations. They didn't want converts, and they really had no interest in other people's beliefs. Now, they would have considered Christians weak and spineless. Their turn the other cheek, love thy neighbour attitudes would certainly not have been the Viking attitude, but they couldn't have cared less what god they worshipped, just as long as they didn't try to make the Vikings worship him too. And if the wealth of the day had been in the hands of, say, the Jews or the Muslims, the Vikings would have ignored Christian churches and raided synagogues and mosques instead. The extent of Norse trading and settlement was really unsurpassed by anyone else. Founding most of the major towns in Ireland, navigating the rivers of Europe from the Baltic right down to the Black Sea and Constantinople, which often meant porting their ships for miles overland to change rivers, and that's no joke. And even reaching Baghdad, bringing exotic furs, beautiful gold and silver jewellery, amber, which is rare around the Mediterranean but common in the far north, and of course, slaves. Yes, slaves were a valuable commodity, and they fetched a good price in the markets of Constantinople. Some acquired along the way, others brought from distant lands, such as Ireland or Britain. There was a raid in Ireland in 821 AD, for example, when a large number of women were taken from Howth in Dublin Bay. We can't fault the Vikings too much for that. Slavery was common right across Europe and the Middle East at the time. It was the norm, and everybody else was doing it, despite the efforts of the church to stop it. So the Vikings simply went with the flow, so to speak. They were interested in profit, and slaves brought considerable profit. They simply brought what the market wanted, which is what good businessmen do, and they were very good. In fact, under the Vikings and later the Norse Gaelic Kingdom of Dublin, Ireland became the largest slave market in Western Europe, centred on Dublin, which was no small achievement, drawing much of the potential merchandise, for want of a better word, from the Irish hinterland and raids on Britain and Ireland. They were expert shipbuilders, the finest of their day. The famous, or well, infamous, I suppose, if you were a resident of a coastal town and saw one approaching. Yes, the famous Viking Longship, being perhaps the most perfect ship ever devised for its intended purpose. Fast, able to sail deep inland along rivers due to its shallow draft, able to reverse direction almost instantly by the rowers simply turning around and rowing the opposite way, which could be very useful in emergencies. If you were going up a river and found the natives had perhaps blocked it or put a chain across or something, or they started shooting arrows at you from the banks, everybody just turns around and rows like Fenrir the Giant Wolf is right behind them the other way, and you're out of danger in no time. That was easy because the Viking Longship was the same at both ends. It didn't have a pointy bit at the front and a rounded bit at the back end, like other ships did. It had a pointy bit at both ends. It was the ideal warship, and no town that lay on a river more than 3 feet deep was safe from it, no matter how far inland it might be. And of course, the Vikings developed navigational techniques that could take them out into the vast expanse of the North Atlantic to Iceland and Greenland, and on to North America, finding Newfoundland, where they settled for a time. And of course, now recent evidence indicates that they went further south, to New Brunswick as well, where they seem to have just had a look and left again after naming it Vinland, due to the wild grapes that grew there. That's actually a very interesting example of how what we think we know sometimes turns out to be something else, as it does rather frequently with the Vikings. It was thought that Leif Erikson had exaggerated a bit with his account of this wonderful Vinland, because wild grapes don't grow in Newfoundland, nor were there rivers full of salmon, and there weren't any natives who used animal skins to build their canoes. So that Leif, well, he hadn't exactly lied. Let's just say he'd been a bit economical with the truth. But more recent excavations at the confirmed Viking site in Newfoundland turned up butternuts. So, big wow, you say, butternuts. Yes, but butternuts do not grow in Newfoundland. However, they are found over 500 miles to the south in eastern New Brunswick, which is actually the northern limit of where you can find them. And significantly, wild grapes grow freely in New Brunswick. There are rivers with salmon, and the natives there used to use animal skins for their canoes. Now, the butternuts didn't bring themselves all the way up to Newfoundland and then bury themselves in a Viking midden heap for some archaeologist woman to find in the 21st century. Obviously, Leif or some of his men had gone down to New Brunswick and brought things back up to the settlement. So Leif Erikson is cleared of telling porky pies, and New Brunswick is clearly the region he named Vinland. Unless, of course, someone is going to suggest that butternuts are like triffids, and they can get up and toddle off all by themselves 500 miles up to Newfoundland. It seems a tad unlikely. Although they'd also have to be able to swim to get from New Brunswick to Newfoundland, since the estuary of the St. Lawrence River sort of gets in the way. Now, I said at the start that the Vikings have been misrepresented, and that's very true. I mean, look at this face. Would I like you? Lurid tales of their merciless savagery abound, their wanton brutality overshadowing all their other attributes. But they're questionable as to accuracy. Yes, they were brutal at times, very brutal, but so too was everyone else. Cities razed to the ground and their inhabitants raped and slaughtered all across Europe and the Middle East, and not a Viking in sight. The Crusaders massacred and raped other Christians in Constantinople, despite being on a quest to find Muslims. And they did even worse in Jerusalem when they eventually got there, cheerfully massacring Arabs and Jews and anybody else who got in their way with equal ferocity. Their savagery even appalling scholars of the time, used as they were to violence. But there weren't any Vikings involved in it. Every army in Europe and the Middle East killed, looted, and raped to various degrees, every one of them. Many far worse than anything the Vikings ever did. Yet, strangely, it is the Vikings who have got the label of merciless brutes, despite the fact that they were little different to anyone else at the time. They simply did it with more style, leaping off dragon-headed ships. And of course, they were pagans, something that made them evil and morally reprehensible in the eyes of the church, so that anything they did was automatically far worse than the same thing done by a Christian. They were demonized simply by their pagan beliefs. Oddly enough, the Vikings, bad as they might be, were probably actually preferable to some other raiders because of their hit-and-run method of attack, being more interested in quick profit, grabbing anything of value that was easily transported and an equally quick getaway, and less inclined to destroy buildings and property or slaughter everyone in sight without a good reason than other raiders of the day, who would go out of their way to devastate a town or even a region without any extra profit to themselves. They just did it because they could. But hanging around just for a bit of vandalism, fun though it might be, gave an enemy time to gather his forces, and that was the last thing a Viking would have wanted to do, especially if he only had a small fleet, maybe 1 or 2 ships. He wouldn't have enough men to fight a pitched battle, and he wasn't going to wait around waiting for one. And it also must be remembered that the Norse did not regard raiding as theft. Indeed, theft was considered a most dishonourable act, something never done by a true warrior, and a thing that would bring disgrace to his name, while raiding was seen as an act of valour, where risk and danger were encountered, and the victor returned with the spoils won by his courage and daring. If Eric the Really Dreadful had broken into your house while you slept, taken your gold, sneaked out to avoid a fight and scurried back to his ship and sailed off as fast as he could, he would have been branded a thief and a coward. But had he kicked in your door, killed anyone who resisted him, burned your house down, and then strolled leisurely back to his ship with your gold, he'd have gone home with honour and his well-deserved booty, having taken risks to obtain it. It doesn't make sense if you think about it. I mean, robbing, let us say, a frail old woman for her purse, as we see so often in our streets today, to a Viking would have been something without honour, branding him a common thief. The same applied to rape. Rape was a very serious crime back home in Scandinavia, but it was seen as one of the spoils to be had when raiding. See, to Viking raiders, there was a difference, a distinct difference, between their women, who were spoils of war, if you like, and thus fair game, and our women, who you touched at your peril, because if a husband or a brother didn't gut you, the woman probably would do it herself. And women, incidentally, could be raiders as well as the men. Oh yeah. A Viking fleet was recorded as landing in Ireland in the late 10th century, led by a woman the Irish called the Red Maiden, who the Irish chroniclers regarded as one of the most dangerous of the Viking leaders. One of the most brutal, in fact, though her evilness was probably a tad exaggerated for propaganda purposes. No name is mentioned for her, but her nickname suggests she may have been a Norwegian woman named Rusla, the daughter of King Keeg of Telemark, who gathered a Viking fleet after her father was overthrown by the Danish King Omund, attacking Danish shipping in revenge. She went on to raid Denmark, the British Isles, and significantly perhaps Ireland, acquiring a fearsome reputation as a bloodthirsty individual who took no prisoners, gaining herself the name the Red Woman in the process. Being captured by her was decidedly bad for one's health. She was eventually brought down by her own brother, Sandus, after King Omund persuaded him to change sides by adopting him as a foster son. Wasn't that nice of him? Sandus was said to have grabbed her by her braids and held her as his men beat her to death with rowing oars. What a superb example of brotherly love. With a brother like him, who needed enemies? And then there's the saga of Hervor. And in that we read how she turned her back on normal female things, trained herself in fighting, and went off with her own ships, raiding and pillaging, becoming a much feared Viking leader, showing that the concept of a female Vikinger was something that was accepted, as indeed was the concept of the shield maiden, though that term is seldom ever found in the Norse sagas. But stories of female warriors are plentiful enough to show that, again, the concept of a woman taking up arms, if need be, was accepted. And there are historical accounts of Norse women in combat as well. Sadly, the impact of Christianity, rather than improving things as might have been expected, was to alter Norse society in not altogether good ways, especially in the treatment of women, who had enjoyed a freedom and personal power almost unknown in the rest of Europe, able to own land, divorce their husbands, control all aspects of the home, and even stop fights between the men, which they would often do by throwing clothes over their weapons or pushing them apart with a pole. There was one woman, Aud Ketilsdottir, known as Aud the Deep Thinker, who travelled to Iceland with her own ship and some 20 men under her command, as well as prisoners captured during raids around the British Isles. Once again, a female with her own ship, just like Hervor in the saga or Rusla. Obviously a kindly woman, despite her involvement with raiding, since she freed the prisoners once they reached Iceland and gifted them land so they could farm and support themselves, which she didn't have to do. They were captives after all and could have simply been used as slaves. And of course she did the same for her own men, parceling it out to those who had accompanied her. She must have been very intelligent, given her nickname, and she became quite politically influential in Iceland. Remembered today as one of the great early Icelanders, being a fine example of just what a Norse woman could accomplish. She completely reversed gender roles and was able to do so. That says a great deal. Unwanted advances, touching or kissing a woman without her consent, were regarded as serious matters. Men had no right to physically interfere with women, and it was considered reprehensible to kill a woman except in very special circumstances. In intertribal conflicts, blood feuds and the like, women would usually be given the chance to leave unharmed before the men would be killed, as in the cases where, say, a house would be surrounded and burnt with the occupants inside, which is a common method of attack given the flammability of the wooden buildings. The women and children would be offered the chance to leave unharmed. Obviously, there were exceptions to that, but overall, the respect for women's rights was an outstanding feature of Norse society. But once Christianized, Norse women lost much of that, being relegated to the decidedly second-class status of women across the rest of Europe. The new religion did, of course, improve trading, since many Christians were reluctant to trade with pagans, that being officially forbidden by the church. And it became easier for them to integrate with those they had settled among, resulting in their becoming less and less Norse and more like those around them, as happened in Ireland, where eventually there was no difference between Norse and Celt, the two cultures becoming one, exemplified as early as 1014 when Norse and Dublin Irish fought together against King Brian Boru at the Battle of Clontarf. It has been suggested that the sudden conversion to Christianity of Iceland, which seemed to happen almost instantly in 1100 AD, one day everyone was a pagan, the next day suddenly, whoa, they're all Christians. It's been suggested that had more to do with economic matters, like improved trade with Christian countries, than it had with any genuine religious fervour, given the noticeable lack of any great devotional aspects of later Icelandic society, as well as pagan influences that have continued even to the present day. The Christian era also eventually brought an end to the raiding, there being little need for it, as Norse society changed to fit the various communities they lived among and gradually became part of. The previously much admired ideals of honour, unbreakable oaths, and implacable warrior courage that had been a hallmark of the Vikings no longer had much place in the world. That was a pity, since, although it had been marked by cruelty and violence, there had been a sense of honour and duty that was, well, sadly lacking in the knights of medieval Europe, who professed to protect the weak and cherish women, while in actuality raping and murdering on a fairly impressive scale themselves, seldom ever living up to what the church itself expected of them when they took their supposedly sacred and binding knightly vows. A Viking never broke an oath, even when, as in the case of Ragnar Lothbrok, keeping it would mean his own death, while a medieval knight seldom kept one if it interfered with his own desires. He just did his own thing, confessed his sins, got absolution, and started all over again. I suppose one could put it in a poetic way and say that then the Viking world sank into the backward-thinking pit of the Dark Ages, and the wonderful dragon ships never sailed again. Look, this video has been little more than some highlights about the Vikings, since to cover the subject fully I've been talking for hours. And there will be further videos on this topic that will go into more detail on specific things about the Norse peoples and their considerable contribution to history. But before I go, a word about runes. On the thumbnail for this video, I spelled the Vikings in runes from the Younger Futhark, which was the system of runic writing used during most of the Viking Age, from around 800 AD onwards. But while it is spelled in the equivalent runes to those letters, you can't actually write modern languages properly in runes because, well, for one thing, they're not pronounced the same way. A Viking, for example, reading what I wrote would not say anything sounding like the Vikings, if he could actually pronounce it in the first place. And some runes can mean different things depending on context. For example, K and G are represented by the same rune as are U and V, and there are special runes for various sounds. But I thought it looked nice on the thumbnail. And it does give a certain Nordic look to it. Plus, it's probably just as accurate as most of the movies and TV shows about Vikings. So, all it is now to do is say goodbye, or farewell, as it would be in Old Norse. And until next time, skål!